This videotape by Jetsunma Ahkon Lhamo was recorded live before a public audience. Jetsunma presents traditional Buddhist teachings in a contemporary way. She reaches out to us, longtime Dharma students and newcomers alike.
Pure view, while being one of the fundamental ideas in the Buddha Dharma, is also one of the most difficult to understand, simply because, in a way, it is so simple. And the simplicity of it is more in accordance with our own true primordial nature, where it is our divided, dualistic, and deluded minds that have difficulty with such concepts as pure view. Pure view is the natural state of our true nature. That is to say, if we were able to awaken to the primordial wisdom state, even at this moment, if we were somehow able to move into the posture that Lord Buddha himself found himself in, that posture of being awake to that nature, pure view would be instantly established. It is characteristic of that nature. And so that is the reason why it is so difficult for us with our present minds that are divided and living in duality and filled with contrivances and distinctions that the enlightened mind are not filled with. For that reason, we are really unable to understand pure view. So I'd like to address how the student entering into the path at first and then in an intermediate way can begin to address pure view. First of all, the situation of the student either flirting with the path or moving closer to the path or considering the path or perhaps even first entering onto the path. That particular student may hear the term pure view. In fact, that's one of the first things that a new student will hear. And of course, that term will become confusing because if we think about what those words ordinarily mean to us, we will try to extrapolate our own meaning rather than waiting until we can come to the point of understanding what pure view actually is. And this is where the first mistake comes in attaining pure view that becomes ultimately harmful to students and ultimately something we have to work through. So for those of you that are new, I would really like to address that. In the beginning, when we come to the path, we feel like we have found something precious. We often feel very excited about it. The idea is almost, it's similar to perhaps waking up on Christmas morning and finding out there's a gift, something that will enrich your life and change your life. And that kind of excitement that we have about something like that would deepen and enrich and change our lives, we feel when we first approach Dharma. We realize that when we have Dharma, there are tools that we didn't have before, that there are ways to understand that are deeper than we had before. We also kind of vibe with some of the fundamental teachings that indicate to us that while everyone here wants happiness equally, most of us lack the skill to determine what the components of happiness actually are. And now, approaching Dharma, we realize that suddenly we're going to be let in on a very vast secret, and that it's going to be very helpful for the rest of our lives. So we're excited. And then, when we approach Dharma also, we often have a romantic period, a period where we fall in love. It's very common, it's very normal, and I think actually in many ways it's very helpful. Because it helps us, you know how it is when you fall in love with a human being, with a person. When you fall in love with a person, you're much able to see their very best qualities. and you're just kind of open to that in the most romantic way. So the same thing happens with Dharma. You're able to see the very best things about Dharma in a very receptive way. This falling in love actually happens. Many students fall in love with just the idea of being on a path, part of a group experience, part of something that is moving together as one body, and the idea of having a teacher. Also, many students are just in love with the sort of exotic quality of many of the things they see in their Dharma practice. It's just so cool to be able to go to a place and feel welcome there that looks a little bit like Nepal or something. It's just so darn cool to bring your friends and everything. And it really is. Many people, that sounds silly and kind of superficial, but it's absolutely normal. When you come to the path, that will be one of your first ideas. It's just so darn cool. And I don't blame you. There aren't many places like this that you can go to that seem as exotic and interesting as this. And then, of course, there's the crystals. All the many colorful things that you can see, just the idea of being in an environment that just feels so different from anything else you've ever been in. These things are very potent, romantic exciters. And as well, when you first get into practice, the idea of sitting in front of a prayer bench. Well, until you sit too long and your knees start driving you crazy, until you realize your entire body, especially your hip bones, have to change shape practically. I remember that myself, believe me. That idea is not exactly the most romantic part, but the idea of sitting in front of a bench and having one of these gizmos, it's so cool, especially when you get what the really authentic decorations are. And then you have a cool book with a cool design on the front of it. It's just so darn cool. And you get to sit there and look like a cool person. And you can put a crystal in front of you, and that looks cool too. You can have these pictures all laid out. I love the look of new Dharma practitioners. They have their drink, they have their books, they have their malas, usually 3 or 4 because, you know, you've just gotten them and they're cool. And their books are stacked up one on top of the other, and it's all very, and of course the deity pictures. They're there and there and there, and a picture of the teacher, and they're all framed, and it's like this. Okay, I'm ready. I don't know what to do yet, I haven't a clue, but I am ready. So that's the kind of falling in love that we do when we enter onto the path. When you fall in love on the path at first, you try to act differently, and it's a little bit like when you fall in love in the worldly sense. When you fall in love in the worldly sense, you kind of get the lay of the land in your relationship, and subtly your own personality begins to change. Any of you remember this? Subtly, you are influenced. And since we all have each other's number and we kind of know what's going on some subtle level, we begin to act in a way that would get more love and more approval and that sort of thing. Well, the same thing happens to us when we approach Dharma. When we approach Dharma, we start to hear some of these terms like renunciation. Well, that's one of the ones that we sort of push in the back because that's not the most comfortable. But anyway, then we fall in love with different ideas like pure view. Boy, doesn't that sound like something you ought to have? Pure view. It sounds so darned cool to have pure view. So not having a clue as to what it means, we begin the great adventure of imitation, which is one of the things that happens when we first enter on the path. We try to walk the Dharma walk and talk the Dharma talk and act the Dharma way, except that we don't have a depth of understanding at this point. So we extrapolate what pure view might be. Pure view might be sitting very straight when you practice and looking very pure. Pure view might be periodically rolling your eyes skyward so that you can look saintly. What do you think? Pure view might be dressing differently all of a sudden, because they are. You know, so you might try to dress a little bit differently. Pure view might be acting pure. You ever seen a person act pure? It's as silly as you can possibly imagine. It's just the silliest darn thing. So people try to act pure. They develop new lines around their lips. And of course they have to be very critical and judgmental about things because now they're pure. So they develop lines around here too. A picture is worth 1,000 words, wouldn't you say? But many people, when they first come to the path, are like that. They're imitating something which is an idea within their own minds. But what happens then is that they begin to go in a certain direction that ultimately becomes detrimental to the path and to their own adherence to the path. In that, when they are trying to act in a way that they think is pure, it's as though they're approaching Dharma in an external way, in a materialistic way. How do I mean materialistic? Well, you'd think, gee, approaching Dharma at all, how can that be materialistic? It is the religion of renunciation. How could you possibly practice it in a materialistic way? And I'll tell you, it's because it is possible to collect Dharma and things associated with Dharma, just in the same way you would collect objects, or the same way you would collect art, the same way you would collect interesting, I know some people like to collect, what are they called? Trivial information? Trivia. Some people love to collect trivia so they can bore all their friends with it. So you might collect Dharma in that way, simply collect Dharma things. And the way that we think about Dharma in the beginning might be tending toward the materialistic. That is to say, now I have Dharma. Now I have a new way to act. Now I have a new way to think. Now I have a new way to dress. These are the baby ideas that come first. And they should not be mistaken with pure view, because pure view could not be further apart from acting purely. It could, or how you think is pure. Pure view could not be further apart. It's just 180 degrees away from that. Because when we act pure, first of all, the word act is the key operative there. It is an act. When real change comes, when pure view comes, it's literally invisible. You see? When pure change comes, when real change comes, you have nothing to show your friends. You see? Because the change is inside. It's very subtle. It's very quiet. And it grows very much like kind of a seedling coming out of the soil. At first, almost invisible. Eventually, it may be a huge bush or a huge tree that will simply take over the area in which it is planted. But in the beginning, it doesn't disturb anything. And it actually starts growing. Doesn't a seedling start growing actually beneath the ground long before it's ever seen above the ground? Well, that's how pure view should grow. If in the beginning, when you come to the path, you start acting differently in such a way that it's very noticeable and you have something external and physical to show your friends, then you might want to step back from that and check and recheck your mind. Perhaps check and recheck your motivation. Perhaps in the beginning, because you are in love, because there are so many things about the path that are exotic. Perhaps in the beginning, you might want to play with that, almost the way a child plays with a new toy. You kind of want to play with that a little bit. It becomes fun. I can understand that, but pretty soon, and I think pretty soon, you should step back from that and re-examine. Perhaps another thing that might be happening is that as it always is in the beginning of entering into Dharma, we haven't really oriented ourselves towards pure motivation. Number one, and also number two, we have not oriented ourselves towards those kinds of internal changes that actually produce happiness. Imitating a change that produces happiness is not the same as changing in such a way as to produce happiness. Because one will have the result that imitation has. It will produce a shallow or imitation result. But the other, which is the deeper way, which is to really examine one's mind and focus on honesty in a very deep inner way, and begin to change the way that one thinks, the way that one relates to cause and effect relationships, the way that one relates to materialism, those things. those things should be changed on an inward level, on a subtle level, simply by examining. The first part of one's path with Dharma should be simply examining. That's all. There should be nothing that you are ever required to do that does not make logical sense to you. Now, the Buddha taught this. The Buddha said that in the beginning, when you are first approaching the path, you should question. Once you have understood the meaning of the path and you have seen the result of the path, then at that point, questioning becomes simply a mental game. It becomes a disturbance, and sometimes becomes almost an addiction. We like to question it. It makes us feel smart. So once you've attained that level, you don't want to question anymore. The thing to do is do your questioning in the beginning. That's fair. And that's the very sanest, very, very, very best first step that you should engage in. If you don't go through that process, but instead start acting like everybody else meaning those people who have been practitioners for a much longer time, at some point, you're going to have to come back and correct. And that correction process can be a little bit traumatic because you have to question yourself. And you have to really pull back the reins hard. Plus, you've already gotten into the habit of thinking of Dharma in a materialistic way. And that's a hard habit to break. It's hard to go from that to a more profound level of purity. When you first enter into Dharma, the thing you want to protect the most is your innocence. Now, how do I mean that? Most people come to Dharma kind of trying to get innocent. We feel that we're kind of weary of the world. We feel like many people, when they come to Dharma, they realize that the cause and effect relationships that constitute their lives aren't really working for them. They realize that oftentimes they feel like they're caught. They don't have the answers. They keep going through the same obsessive compulsive behavior again and again and again, and it's not producing happiness. They realize that many of the things in their lives are simply dead-end streets. I mean, they're just not producing what we had thought they would. And so they're looking for something deeper, something richer, something purer. So they're coming to the path to find innocence, interestingly. And that's why it's a shame when new students will actually make the mistake of abandoning their own natural innocence in order to act like someone else. That would be a mistake. What is your natural innocence? What is it that you have when you first come to the path? When you first come to the path, hopefully, this is the way that would be the best way to come to the path with the best result, would be almost as a child, you see, as a seeker, as an innocent, someone whose mind is open. Well, there's an analogy, actually, that's used in traditional Buddhism, and that is the analogy of the mind being like a bowl. The best way to come to the path is with your mind as a bowl that is upright. That means the opening is on top. The mind is like a bowl. The bowl itself should be clean and pure, and there should be nothing dirty in the bowl. The bowl should not be cracked, and the bowl should not be turned over. And that's a symbolic picture of the way your mind should be when you come to the path, simply like a bowl. And I remember that when I first taught some of my older students, I actually used to ask them during Dharma teaching, would you keep your hands like this? Reminding yourself, almost practicing the mudra of a bowl. Reminding yourself that your mind should be like that. Now, if you were to come to the path with a lot of judgment and preconceived ideas, there are some people that come to the path and they actually don't listen to any of the teaching at all. They don't absorb what's going around them. It's like their intake buttons are broken. They simply don't absorb. They simply extrapolate their own religion. They come in here and just get religious in their own way. And they just think that's fine. That would be like a bowl that is turned over. You pour the milk into the bowl and it simply runs down the sides. There's no way for it to enter into the bowl and remain there. It can't be drunk, it can't be used, it's gone. you see? And there are many students that come to the path. It's like, I guess they've had many traumas in their lives. I guess they have negative habitual tendencies and negative result from past actions. But they come to the path filled with anger, hatred, judgment, a hard edge, just a hard edge. They come into the room and you can feel it. It's kind of like, well, I'll just see. It's kind of like that. And they take what the teacher says, which is given in all honesty, hopefully, with the idea to really be of benefit, to make happiness in the world. And instead of just like listening to that and saying, well, let's see now, does that make sense to me? That would be the right way to determine. Does that make sense to me? Does it seem reasonable? Does the person who's teaching seem like the source might be all right? What is the result of that person's life? Can I trust this? Those are the thoughts that you can have that would be useful to you. Is it reasonable? Is it logical? Does it seem like it could be true? But that's not the case of the other kind of person. The other person would come in and say, I really don't plan on believing any of this. And they have this idea like, if you can get through to me, have at it, sister. Either that, or they have the idea that their knowledge is superior and that they have nothing to learn really, and that they come into the room just kind of thinking, I don't really need anything. They have the idea that everything's just fine. They haven't thought through that they too are suffering, that they too are creating the causes for unhappiness, that they too are living with the reality of life and death, old age and sickness, these things that are part of the human existence. So not thinking in that way, they have this idea that they can just come in here and be closed. Those people are like a bowl with poison or filth on the bottom of it. You can pour the most high quality milk, the best, the freshest, most pure milk into that bowl, and no matter what kind of milk it is, no matter how wonderful it is, once it enters that bowl, it will be impure and unusable. And that's actually what happens, unfortunately, with many students. They walk away dissatisfied. No nourishment. They haven't drunk the milk, you see? It hasn't nurtured them. They don't feel better. And it's because either the mind was turned over, like that bowl, or there was poison there and they weren't able to absorb. They weren't able to listen. So they're not nourished. They've literally come to a banquet and walked away hungry. So the way for a new student to practice some version of pure view would be to simply try to relax the mind as much as possible. Try to consider what is being taught in a relaxed and pure way with a mind that is gentle, opened, receptive. You see? It isn't necessary to decide or to make a judgment. It isn't necessary to do that in the beginning. One simply listens. Sometimes I look around the room at new students and I see certain faces, that have an effect on me. I can see innocence there. I can look a little bit deeper perhaps and I can see that that person may not consider themselves innocent. Perhaps they've had many different unwholesome experiences, many different relationships that they consider unwholesome, many different activities that they consider unwholesome. In fact, these people may come to the path simply wondering, am I all right? Can I fit in? What should I do? I just don't feel good. But I look at these people and I see simply because they are listening and trying to understand in a natural way. Their faces are open, they're trying to hear. Those people to me are more innocent than perhaps even those people who come to the path satisfied that they've lived upright, moral lives, always pay their taxes, have only one marriage, and they have been faithful. They hate the person, but they've always been faithful. And, they have that kind of idea that they've lived according to the apple pie American dream, and they come in a little bit hard, kind of hard, not receptive. I think in that case, perhaps there is less innocence. So this innocence that I'm talking about is a subtle thing. It's a quality of the mind. And it's a new way to understand your own value as well, isn't it? It's a new way to understand something about yourself that you might not have understood before. And doesn't it relate to the teaching that I gave the children? Pencils are made with erasers, for real. And one of the things that we know on the path is that should you come to the path and accept the path and learn that it is appropriate for you and feel that this is intelligent and logical and it's reasonable, then then you begin to practice. If that is what's happening to you, then within the path is the technology to eradicate and to change utterly every past cause that you have ever created in this or any other life that will bring you suffering in this or any future life. You have that opportunity on the path. And so where you've been before and what's happened before and even what you think about yourself doesn't really matter. What matters is what you do today. What is your mind like? Is it loaded with poison? Is there poison at the bottom of it? Are you filled with judgment? Are you unable to taste that pure milk because there's something in your mind that just keeps messing it up? Or is the mind kind of turned over, unreceptive, to where it's just not possible to get through to you? You're not taking in. You're not hearing. You're not seeing. You're not tasting. You're simply continuing with your method. And you haven't examined that your own method has brought you suffering. So these are the things that you should examine. You know, I have had the most amazing experience as a teacher. And that is that there is actually quite a large percentage of my Sangha, relatively speaking, that are recovering alcoholics. There are people in my Sangha that have come from prison. There are people in my Sangha that have had horrendous and difficult and deeply traumatic pasts. What must they have felt like when they first came to the path? Everything that I've described, don't you think? They must have come here wondering if there could ever be a place that they could belong in. And don't you think people that have the habit of living non-virtuous lives, when they first come to the path, they often try to run some of their numbers. You know what I mean by that, don't you? Play some of the kind of neurotic mental games that we play in order to perpetuate ourselves in the way that we understand ourselves, because change frightens us. But somehow they've all gotten through this. And whether they hit that point of innocence in the beginning or whether later on they came to that point of innocence again, at some point they decided that they are forgiven, that there is no such thing as forgiveness, really. That what one has to do is realize that pencils are made with erasers, and that at every moment it is possible to honestly look at one's past habitual tendencies, honestly see the non-virtue, honestly make a change, and honestly begin in a new way. And it is also possible to make restitution. Restitution is extremely important because once one is able to view a pure and virtuous life and really see it in a way that makes the light go on, you see, once that actually happens, then at that point we begin to look at our previous lives and we get a funny feeling. And sometimes we wonder, gee, should we even be thinking like this? Because that feeling is a bit uncomfortable. We look at the activity that we have now that seems very virtuous and is very virtuous, and then we look at what we did before, and by comparison, it feels kind of gross. It becomes gross. It becomes kind of icky. You know, you have that feeling of ickiness. When that begins to happen, we feel uncomfortable enough to doubt what we're doing now, the virtuous stuff. And sometimes we back off from it. But in fact, those students who have come and have come to that point of innocence and have really considered all that they have done have been listening to Dharma teachings for some time, have come to understand that all that took place before was simply a mind that was ignorant, uneducated, ignorant about cause and effect relationships. That mind was wandering really helplessly in samsara, confused about what are the causes of happiness. What are the causes that bring about a good result? That's what has happened to you before that time. It should be viewed more in the sense of mistake than it should be viewed in the sense of labeling you as a bad person. Until the mind understands, until we understand something about cause and effect relationships, such as, and here are some typical ones, the idea that being kind toward others, that is to say, caring for others, making them feel welcome, going out of one's way to promote and create happiness in others in a selfless way, that this actually brings about extreme happiness, that is the cause for happiness. And if you had practiced like that in this lifetime, you would never be lonely. You see? If all of your activity had been like that in the past, in this lifetime, you would never, ever feel alienated or lonely. Not for a moment. You would never feel unloved. You would never wonder if the others around you love you enough. You would never feel needy or graspy in an emotional way. You would never try to manipulate other people or become obsessed with other people or do any of those things, because you'd be tanked up, satisfied. But we haven't created the causes for that. In the past, our motivation for benefiting others, for being with others has always been mixed. We have been selfish. We have been demanding. We have abandoned others, not only in this lifetime, but in other lifetimes as well, simply because we did not know about virtuous activity. We did not know what is good and what is pure. We did not know what is appropriate to bring about good result. And so not knowing that, there's pretty much a 50-50 chance as to what you're going to do. If everything is based on chance, who knows what you'll do? But you see, once you know, the proper thing to do at that point is to gain some self-honesty, to really examine the mind, what it does, how it works, how much of what you do is really self-absorption, how much of what you do is actually selfishness, how much of what you do is judgmental, how much of what you do is really not kind, heavy-handed, manipulative, for your sake. And then once you've gained some insight into that through self-honesty, and it's not comfortable to examine oneself from time to time. So once one has gained self-honesty, then a decision is made. I see that, what I have done, I see the way that I've acted in the past, I see that this activity brings no good result. I'm beginning to understand the connection between cause and effect relationships and how interdependent they are. And so my idea is that now that I know, I wish to be completely honest about my activity in the past. I wish to look at myself in the mirror very squarely, examine my own root poisons, that of jealousy, pride, selfishness, hatred, that sort of thing. These root poisons I want to examine, and I want to begin to systematically eradicate them. And so the way to do that, most especially in the beginning, is not to act any differently at all at first. And here's why. Because if you have the idea that in the past you haven't been kind, and now you're lonely, you're correct. But supposing what you do about that is to simply act kind all the time, which means act the way you think kindness ought to look. Well, there are as many ideas about what kindness ought to be as there are people sitting in this room. And I have watched people many, many times do that act in the beginning. They learn a few things about what might be the right way to go, and they begin to act like that. Well, what happens is it precludes or prevents subtle change, internal change. Because you're too busy acting on the external. You can see how that might be, can't you? It's a different kind of process. Plus the idea that they may not be correct about what is kind. Then there's the other thing called the rubber band phenomena. Do you know about the rubber band phenomena? Well, if you take a rubber band, could be the best in the business, could be the kind of rubber bands that the U.S. military buys, the ones that cost $3,000 and $4,000 a piece. You know, those are state-of-the-art techno rubber bands. And that being the case, even if you had one of those, if you were to take this rubber band and start stretching it, and just stretch it radically, boom, 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 all the way out, eventually that rubber band is either going to break or it's going to work itself loose and snap back to its original shape. And so if you begin to try to change on an external or gross level without examining the teaching and letting your mind create a new habitat is what I mean to say, internally, in a gentle way, your mind is going to do the same thing that rubber band does. It has a natural shape. Yes, you can change, you can make it perform. You know that you and other people have made yourself jump through hoops before, and it will probably happen again. So you can do that. You can make your mind change. But the result won't be as good, because it will be temporary, because it's happening in a gross and inappropriate way. So practicing Dharma in the way that I'm describing, which is sort of internally examining at first, taking it slow, coming at it with honesty and purity, understanding fully, letting your cup be filled with some real milk, absorbing the teachings, listening with a pure mind. That sort of thing would be a little bit like taking this state-of-the-art rubber band and perhaps rubbing it with a fluid or an oil or something that would help it to expand, and perhaps expanding it only slightly, and then coming back again and rubbing it and working it a little bit more, actually changing the fiber of the rubber band so that eventually it becomes a much looser thing, you see? And that's eventually what will happen to your mind. Your mind actually becomes much looser, more spacious, more gentle, more relaxed, a bigger bowl, a place where Dharma can live, a place where some truth can come in, whereas now, that's a little bit difficult. So in the beginning, pure view for the new student would be more like an honest effort, more like an innocence, more like a relaxation. Now eventually, for the older student, pure view becomes a more meaningful and more profound phrase. And I thankfully had a bit of information from one of my oldest students. I don't mean oldest in terms of her personal age, but I mean been with me a long time. She's one of my oldest students, and she said to me something about what a hard time she's having with pure view. And she explained to me her experience, and let me give you a little background on that. In terms of pure view, the idea is that pure view actually comes from some of the practices that we do in the Dharma path. And it originates with what we call generation stage practice. And that means that in Dharma, you do something called a puja, which is a meditation practice. It has certain components in it that within the puja one takes refuge, one takes the vows of compassion or kindness, one meditates on emptiness, which is the true primordial nature, and then from the meditation on emptiness, and one meditates on oneself as being that truly empty primordial nature, then one gives rise to the meditational deity. That is to say, one's own self appears naturally as the meditational deity. And one meditates on the meditational deity in such a way as to see certain postures that the deity has, certain ornaments that the deity wears, certain hand implements that the deity has, all of which have a specific meaning about the quality of mind. The deity symbolizes the mind of enlightenment, you see. And meditating as oneself, meditating on oneself as the deity and giving rise to that is actually a tool. One generates oneself as the deity and meditates on certain hand implements. For instance, let's say in the case of Chenrezig or Avalokiteshvara. In Chenrezig, two of his hands are holding in the center, like this, a wish in the mudra of prayer, a wish-fulfilling jewel right there in the center of the palms. Those are what two of his hands are doing. When we meditate on that, what we are actually doing is remaining absorbed in the idea that through practice, through Dharma practice, and particularly through the practice of compassion, because that is Chenrezig's main attribute, through the practice of compassion, we have within our hands, therefore, a wish-fulfilling jewel, because all happiness comes from the practice of compassion, and all happiness comes from pure practice. So when we generate ourselves as the deity, we are meditating on this particular angle, this particular idea. And so at any rate, within the context of this practice, there is the self-generation of oneself as the deity. There is the activity of the deity, which is that the deity makes offerings, the deity then receives the blessing of all the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas and becomes empowered. And at that point, the mantra, you don't have to remember this, new guys, this is just a serial box top version. The mantra encircles around the Buddha's heart, the meditational deity's heart, which is then your heart, and virtuous activity naturally ensues. Now, in generation stage practice, one of the things that happens is that you begin to lose the fixation on your ordinary habitual tendencies that are actually non-virtuous. And you begin to gain the habitual tendency of spontaneously abiding in a naturally compassionate, pure, and virtuous way. And happiness begins. Now, when you finish with that generation stage practice, and those of you that pursue Dharma and continue to come will learn how to practice that very quickly on the path. When the generation stage practice is completed and you've dissolved the deity and done the prayers of praise and done the dedication prayers and prayed that all sentient beings would be happy, you close your book, you put away your mala, your practice actually doesn't end. And that's where pure view comes in. Once one has received empowerment as the deity, has practiced generation stage practice as the deity, and has maintained that, and has done that practice, at that point, the mind becomes increasingly more and more likened to the virtue and attributes of the deity. That is to say, even when the practice is over, you maintain deity pride. People go, pride? That's not religious. Yes, it is. One kind of pride. The kind of pride that's personal pride that results in conceitedness or arrogance. That ain't it. So if you're walking around feeling conceited or arrogant, you haven't got deity pride, you're just conceited and arrogant. So sorry. Deity pride is something different. It's confidence. It's confidence is what it is. View and confidence. If you are practicing the deity Chenrezig and you realize that Chenrezig's main attribute is benefiting sentient beings through compassion, you maintain in a solid way, kind of inwardly virtuous and upright, a kind of idea. You maintain the idea that compassion is your lifeblood, that this is everything to you. You declare it, you wish it, you seek it, you try to find it, you try to make it. You look for it in your mind, you try to bring it out, you try to create the habit of kindness. And as well, once you assert deity pride, you begin to think of yourself differently. You hold yourself with respect. Respect. You know, when you're engaged in non-virtuous activity, although you try to be arrogant about it, you don't have much respect for yourself. And inside, sometimes way inside, sometimes inaudibly inside, there is a person crying because that person is not happy with non-virtuous behavior. Crying. When you begin to practice generation stage practice, that crying is satisfied. There is a natural happiness that begins to occur because kindness is a happier life experience than lack of it. And no matter what deity you're practicing, whatever his or her particular attribute is, that attribute always has the element of kindness, and it always has the elements in it that produce happiness. And so the deity pride is pure intention, conviction, courage. The courage to change one's habits, the courage to continue, the courage to know yourself as something pure. That kind of courage, that's what's called deity pride. And that is the first step of pure view. And that is also the first thing that actually begins to change your life and to change your ability to be happy. In the beginning on the path, you'll hear these words, and for many of you, I can see you're kind of quietly nodding or thinking. And I can see that to some of you this makes sense. I know it makes sense. I know it because it's logical. It's logical that kindness would produce happiness. It isn't logical that lack of kindness and cruelty would produce happiness. It simply isn't reasonable. You can't get bananas from apple seeds. Like produces like. So it's reasonable. And yet what's going to happen in the beginning is that even while this is reasonable, and even while you try to create the habit of these virtuous qualities, in the beginning you'll find your old habits will still dominate. And it's just exactly like what I said to the children when they were here. We know that. It's to be expected. That's why pencils are made with erasers. In the beginning, the best way that you can do to strengthen your practice, and this was asked me by a student. A student asked me, what do you do with obsession? What do you do with compulsion? What do you do with that? The obsession that we have to continue with our old, non-happy patterns. The compulsion to have something. You know, there were some people that feel like they've got to have a certain kind of relationship, and if they don't have that certain kind of relationship, they will simply go out and get another one. And if that one doesn't work, they'll go out and get another one. Then they'll have a couple at a time, and they'll just keep trying. And every time they're disappointed, and they don't get it. They just don't connect the dots. The reason why is because the habitual tendency of that kind of self-gratification without thinking is heavy. It's almost like a weight. You see, like that. And on the side where there is the kind of virtuous activity that would produce happiness, like this one. Do you ever think of this? Simply loving. Simply expressing love. Simply in an open way, in an undemanding way. Investing in a relationship or a series of relationships, or perhaps even no relationship, but just friendships. Perhaps just based on, I'm here and I'm okay, and I'd like to be kind to you and I'd like to love you. Would you like to do that with me also? That kind of relationship. That doesn't occur to hardly any of us. But anyway, that kind of habit, that one of kindness and a lack of self-absorption, considering the welfare and happiness of others, that column is pretty darn light, you see. So in terms of how to change in a real way, in a lasting way, in a way that is beneficial, instead of going back and examining all your bad habits and sort of putting your mind on that pile, which makes it actually heavier and tighter, you see? That's the obsessive compulsive pile right there. You're making it heavier and tighter. Instead of that, you would simply want to let it go. Just open your mind. Do not remain absorbed in these things. Open your mind. You've seen it. You're honest. You know what it is. That's fine. Go over here. Go over here. Begin to create a weighty pile of causes for happiness. If you were to look at yourself and decide that your whole life you've been selfish and hostile, let's say that's pretty much your whole life. If you were to meditate on that and just get tense about it, do you think that you would produce change? I don't think so. I've never seen it happen. And I think that when people can't change on the path, that's why. They can't let go. They can't relax. They can't open their minds. A better way to do that would be to simply begin now, like right now. Like right this minute. I mean, you can do that. That's an option. Think about it. To create virtuous causes. And what that might look like is just right now, within your mind, just quietly, you could say within your own mind, I pray that all sentient beings will be happy. So easy. I pray that all sentient beings will be happy. That's only 9 words. You've made sentences much longer than that before. I've heard some of you talk. Some of you make endless sentences. So 9 words. You can do this. This isn't hard. Just make a prayer for others. Then you could go out to the stupa and circumambulate the stupa, which gives it even more potency. And you can make that prayer again. And you can think about all the people in your life that you're trying to get something from, like approval, like love, kind you want, lots of attention and presence. And it might be the people you're trying to get some money out of, or trying to get some kind of satisfaction out of. There's people that you need to make you feel good. How about this? How about, because that's in this pile, that's the heavy one. How about instead of that, you might look at all of the relationships in your life and see them as the same as you in that they all want to be happy and they don't know how. They don't know how to create the causes. And you might begin to pray for them. You might begin to say, more than my wishing you would pay lots of attention to me, I wish that you would be well. I wish for your happiness. I pray for your happiness. I pray for that. And you can begin to think about whether there's anyone in your immediate environment who could use a friend. And you could begin to think about how in this whole world, this whole earth plane as we know it, there is an overabundance, unbelievable abundance, a cloud that hangs over us of simply non-virtuous, selfish activity. Every day people go to work and do selfish things for selfish purposes. Governments, whole governments, consist of people who do selfish things for selfish purposes. Wars are fought for selfish purposes. Children die because there are selfish purposes. They die of hunger in a world that could easily afford to support itself with food, if we weren't so concerned with material gain. These are the real problems, and the whole world every day cranks them out, cranks them out. What a gift, what a gift. If you can begin right now to crank out something different. You don't have to change on the outer level. You just change on the inside, slowly. Have respect for yourself. Start where you are. Don't pretend you're somewhere else. Start exactly where you are with honesty and innocence. Innocence because you're not faking it, you see? Start exactly where you are, who you are. Just like that, gently. Be gentle with yourself. Later on, as some of those subtle internal changes begin to happen, the older students become more requiring of themselves. They begin to look deeper. They begin to really invest in Dharma. They begin to really look at the big game plan, which is that they want to be happy, and they want all sentient beings to be happy as well. They've studied samsara, or cyclic existence, the cycle of death and rebirth, and they see all you have to do is pick up the newspaper. Pick up today's paper. It's filled with misery. The older students, perhaps they look at that enough times with the training that they've had, and they say, enough is enough. There is enough suffering. Too many people are dying too young. Too many people are hungry. Too many people are lonely. Too many people are without help. Too many people are wandering with no answers and no support. How is that possible? And so they begin to understand that that is the case, and now they understand that it's time for them to really get themselves in order and be a force for benefit in the world. That's what happens to the older students. And then when that begins to happen, they naturally change. Their lives naturally change. And they change because they want them to. They change because it occurs naturally. with enthusiasm and love and willingness that they simply didn't have before in the beginning. In the beginning, all that one can do and what one should do, what is appropriate, is to simply leave the mind open like a bowl, begin to understand, begin to put two and two together and begin to understand cause and effect relationships, and then begin to have an idea that may be the first pure idea. I wish to bring compassion to the world. I wish to begin now. And I know I have one student that expressed this, and I was grateful because it's the thought of many new students. In the beginning, you feel like, I have no virtue. You know, I've lived a very sad life. I've done things that are bad. I'm sorry for them, but I've done them, and that's just the way it is. And I've always been selfish, and I've always been hateful, and I simply don't know how to change, and I simply don't think I can do this. To that person, I want to say, thank you. Thank you for being honest. You are much more pure than the person who looks in the mirror and says, well, I'm a good person. I've never done anything wrong. I've never hurt anybody. Everything's fine. I don't need to listen to any of this, and I certainly don't need to change, most of all. That person is going to have a difficult time. That's the bowl turned over. The person who doesn't know if they can change, who's honest with themselves and doesn't know. That person, I think, is very pure. So, please try to take into account some of the things that I've said. Now is the time for looking. Now is the time for learning. Now is the time for connecting the dots, you see? Now is the time for bridging gaps. Now is the time for weighing things out and seeing where we are. Now is the time for deciding what produces happiness and what doesn't. Now is the time for listening. Be gentle with yourself. Respect yourself. Start where you are as you are. And believe me, you will go much further on the path. Much further. Each person starts a journey exactly where they are. And there's no other way to do it. So those are my teachings for today, and I hope that they'll be helpful. I try to, on Sunday mornings, I try to give the kinds of teachings that, should you even not care about remaining on the path or don't like the B word at this point, that's the B word is the Buddhist word. If you're not comfortable with that, still these teachings, that doesn't exempt you. These are very logical, reasonable teachings that will benefit anyone in their ordinary life, no matter what religion you are or what religion you're not. Kindness should be part of you. The consideration of yourself as something pure, the wishing to be happiness, the wanting to create causes for happiness, these are all things that are part of you. And they can be brought forth no matter who you are or under what circumstances. So please, if you're beginning the path, take these words into consideration as a good way to start. And if you're just visiting for the first time, take this home as a gift, and perhaps it will make you happier. So thank you very much for being here today.